I'm happy to go, but you can go too.
No, go for it.
Do you want to go? I want to talk about the thing that's on my mind is climate change as a threat to global development. And again, that sounds cliche, but with the Paris meetings that have been going on, it's certainly been on my mind. I've also been doing research on it and been thinking a lot about it. And I think the thing that's been challenging a bit as a researcher is just sort of the more we've looked at data, the more we've analyzed the problem and tried to figure out what the implications of climate change could be for global poverty, the worse the picture looks. And that's been something that's been really very difficult. Social scientists have a role to play in this. There's sort of like different steps that lead from CO2 emissions to global poverty. There's how the emissions affect the atmosphere and how those changes in the atmosphere affect temperature, and then temperature may affect economic activity in various ways. It may affect different economic activities differently. So it's a pretty complex system. What we've been doing in some recent research is very much focusing on that last step, from temperature changes to economic outcomes, political outcomes. And of course, people had thought about this before. There's economists and others who had studied the issue before, but with pretty minimal data for the most part. Just in the last few years, there's some studies on it, but climate economists, environmental economists had made assumptions about how 2 degrees Celsius warming, 3 degrees, 4 degrees Celsius warming might affect the economy. The impacts that we're estimating in data we've looked at are an order of magnitude higher than those existing estimates. They kind of estimated that if the world warms by 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, maybe global output will fall 5%, or 3%. Like tiny effects, these minimal effects. And those are, they're these called integrated assessment models, IAMs, and they're really just pulling data out of the air. I mean, I think they would even acknowledge that they're kind of made up data. They're really old, a lot of them. Some are newer, and we're finding that in the latest estimates with my co-authors Solomon Shang and Marshall Burke, we're finding that our best guess is in the next 60, 70 years, global GDP would fall by about a quarter due to climate change, with our best guesses about what climate change is going to look like. Global GDP is going to, so just huge effects that are really large, and the implications of this are really important for global poverty for a couple of reasons. Two at least. One, what we're finding when we look at these relationships is increasing temperature has a different effect depending on whether you start out cool or warm as a country. That makes total sense. So the models predict that if you're Canada or Norway, some northern country, a little bit of warming is actually really good. There's more arable land, you don't have to spend as much on heating bills, whatever. There's all these benefits. Those guys are probably going to grow faster. So some of the rich northern countries, if anything, as the world warms, are going to get richer. The poorest countries that start out hot are going to be really, really hurt. So what we're finding is this negative effect of increasing temperature gets even more pronounced when you start out hot. And that makes a lot of sense too. Agriculture can be supported up to certain temperatures, but when you get really hot and really dry, yields fall off really, really quickly. So for a lot of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia in particular, 3 or 4 degrees Celsius warming is just catastrophic for agriculture. And then the latest data, and this is where it just keeps getting worse and worse. And I just want to share with you guys why I'm so worried about it. I think this is such a major issue to think about. Even outside of agriculture, there's more and more evidence that labor productivity falls at high temperatures. So there's some recent studies looking at Indian factory workers. Indian factory workers do not work in an air-conditioned environment. Like, this isn't a beautifully controlled thing at 65 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that. It's hot as hell in the factory. So when it's hotter outside, they're hotter, they're sweatier, and their labor productivity falls as well. That's even true in the U.S. For workers who work outside, who have manual labor jobs and whatnot. When it gets hot, their labor productivity falls too. So we have these agricultural effects, we have these non-agricultural effects. The effects are particularly bad in hot countries. So the poorest regions of the world, sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, are going to lose the most. Their GDPs could fall a lot, even more than by a quarter. And some of the richest areas of the world in the global north are going to get richer or kind of stay the same. So we're staring at this world, 60, 70, 80 years from now, where global GDP is falling, inequality is growing. It's incredibly bleak. It's incredibly bleak. So that's kind of like the research I've been working on over the last few months, again, with huge props to my co-authors who really took the lead on this particular project. I'd worked with them before, looking at the implications for political instability of rising temperatures, and those are really bleak too. So not surprisingly, when the economy collapses, there's an increased risk of civil war and violence and crime and sort of social instability as well. So these are two papers that both have these broad findings on climate change and the economy, climate change and politics. And in all the data we've put together, the impacts on poor countries are going to be particularly bad for Africa and South Asia. So we're really staring at this bleak, unfair world. And the thing that upsets me, like just makes me physically ill to think about, is all this CO2 that's being pumped up in the atmosphere. It isn't being pumped up by people in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not. They didn't cause climate change. Like, we cause climate change in the US, Europe, now China. It's like the wealthier parts of the world that are poisoning the atmosphere, leading to these temperature increases. But the price is going to be paid in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia in particular. And just the profound, you talked about in the beginning of this, climate change and justice and sort of climate justice, like the injustice of what's going down right now is so severe. It's heartbreaking. It's actually really heartbreaking. So anyway, the more data we look at, the more research we do, the worse the picture looks here. It's really bleak.
How would you? I have like a bunch of questions and like thoughts on everything you said. But one of them is, how do you take? You're taking one variable, it seems, which is the climate change, and you're ascribing like ginormous reaction to it. What about when you have? I feel like the biggest change agents are the things that you don't end up foreseeing, like you don't predict it. Like the things that you can graph, it's like the outliers that really. That's something that I've just noticed when just looking at trends in history. Is like we predict, and then it's like boom, something nobody could have ever foreseen that changes the whole deal. So how do you? How do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the outlier that would be great, or the thing that we can't predict that would be great, would be some kind of technological adaptation to higher temperatures. If whenever we've discussed these results, or whenever these issues come into public policy debate, there's an argument. Well, we'll innovate our way out of it. We've innovated our way out of a lot of stuff. There's so much innovation going on. We just need the right energy technologies. We need the right adaptation, the right agricultural technology. Then we can adapt our way out of it. So that would be an amazing technological innovation that could help. But will that happen? I don't know.
I think Sam's a good friend of mine, and so I've talked with Sam about this. He kind of gave me the idea for it. It's that yes, you can come up with brilliant innovations that'll make that big change, but maybe the big change is in something. I mean, it's probably going to be something we literally cannot predict, but maybe it's not necessarily in technology. Maybe it's in like spirituality or in people's actual view of social justice, or maybe the technology will catalyze people to be able to we're talking about ourselves here, to the people who are screwing over the people in sub-Saharan Africa, to actually be able to face it. And I wonder what will be that catalyst of change. Will that be a person? Would that be I don't know. What do you think?
I'm not sure. I think we were talking about empathy before, and I think there's too little empathy about this problem. I don't think there's perfect understanding of it. Some of the fear is, in some ways, it's already too late. Like, we've already pumped so much CO2 into the atmosphere. We're going to continue warming for some time to come. So we've already done damage that's going to be really hard to undo. But 2 degrees Celsius, maybe we can manage. 4 or 5 degrees Celsius increase is just a whole other ballgame. Then you really get out into that region of very high temperatures where things can sort of fall off the cliff. I was discussing this with a friend of mine, an economist. I was giving a talk, and he said, well, if it gets really hot in Africa, and it gets nicer, to live in Russia, we can, just move hundreds of millions of people up to Siberia. Like, people come up with these ideas, but I don't know what the practicalities of that are.
Work out.
Yeah, I mean, think about the challenges there. So
it's pretty wild.
So that's the thing that's really on my mind. I don't have the solution. You guys said, what's the solution to global poverty? One solution would be major investments in clean energy and reduce CO2 emissions in the rich countries. I mean, China and India in particular. I mean, India is a funny case because India is polluting a lot, and they're actually contributing more and more to global CO2 emissions. But they're also going to suffer a lot, from it. Parts of China will also suffer from warming, but they're a bit farther north, and parts of them won't suffer as much. But if we could reduce CO2 emissions massively in the next decade, it could make a huge difference for billions of people's lives going forward. And I don't think people frame it. I don't know. In the U.S. political debate, is so strange on this issue because people haven't even acknowledged that there's a problem. So it's the first step in recovery, right? Is to actually acknowledge the problem. And, yeah, exactly, right. At least like in the EU and Japan, when like people are kind of aware there's a problem, they may not have the stomach to deal with it. But that's what's on my mind. That's what's worrying me a lot these days, Martin.
Good.